everyone, it's Eugene, and welcome to Forensics Talks. This is going to be episode 73, and my guest today is Stanley Bezuidenhout, and he's going to be with us from speaking from South Africa. Before I get started, I just want to cover a couple of things, and one of them here is the Forensic Photography Symposium that I'm going to be hosting January 16 to 19, 2023. It's coming up just a couple months away. We ran this last year and it was a great success. We had over 300 people who attended. We had manufacturers who were involved. We had people from all over the world who were talking about just different techniques, methods, hardware, software, and things like that when it comes to forensic photography. And the applications were varied as well. So there was crime scene, there was anthropology, there was traffic and collision reconstruction and techniques that are used there as well. So a lot of really cool stuff, a lot of really interesting things. And what I'll do here just very quickly is I'll put up the link to the website. That's the general website there. It has a registration. We have the general schedule that's up there, and I've actually got one that's in the work here. So it's a rough draft with some already, we have abstracts already. If you're interested in an abstract, go to the abstracts and submit it. The general layout is going to be similar to last year, and this is kind of how it's broken out. It's 3.5 days. The first morning is going to be where we have a virtual reception, just a meet and greet kind of thing. And we do that in Zoom breakout rooms and stuff like that. If anyone has any issues, you just pop on early and then we do our best to help you out. Also, the afternoon is basically all presentations, keynote starting at 1 p.m. The rest of the days, the morning sessions are from 10 to 12, and we do a number of different things there, including networking sessions. We do things with vendors, and we have what we call these Tech Talks rapid fire sessions, a series of short presentations, either from manufacturers or from people that have maybe not a full presentation, but just really interesting information that they want to present or pass along. So that's kind of cool. But jam-packed. It is recorded. So what we do is, I know a lot of people are busy these days and they're doing a lot of things, they're traveling and that sort. So what we do is we record it and we make the recordings available for a period of 2 weeks after the symposium. So go ahead, have a look at that. What I'll do is, before I'm finished, I will put that on again, and you can all have a look afterwards. So let me take that off right now. And I see that some people have been dropping some comments there. Oh, we have some of our regulars here. Hey, welcome everyone. And thanks for being here. I always like to know where people are from. Where are you watching from? So by all means, please type in the chat window. Let me know where you are watching this live stream from. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to queue up here and get ready to introduce our guest. So Stanley Bezuidenhout is a military intelligence veteran, a former specialist police reservist, a forensic specialist, court expert, witness trainer, published author, and public speaker with more than 20 years experience. He's served private, commercial, and government clients internationally in South Africa, large parts of Southern Africa, in Canada, the Middle East, and in the USA. He's provided training in forensics and in risk mitigation all over the world, and he's been featured on a variety of television programs in South Africa and in printed media and online internationally. It's his background in special investigations, military intelligence, and police operations that has established him as a leader in transport risk mitigation, investigation, and training. So I invited Stanley here to talk about the justice system in South Africa. But one thing that happens every time that we speak, we tend to diverge and we end up with a very long conversation in so many different areas. So I'm not really sure where we're going to get to. Nothing is scripted here, but I'm going to ask him a whole bunch of different things on different aspects of forensics and investigations in South Africa. So let me bring him in here. There he is. Hey, Stanley.
Hello, Eugene. How are you today?
I am absolutely fine. Thank you very much. I know that it's late in South Africa, but it's also hot.
Right? Yes, we've had a very hot day. I look a little bit pink today. I spent a lot of time in the sun. We were doing a live demonstration with some of the local ministers, etc., on a national road. And we had like kind of a mock crash and a mock spill, and we had hazmat people coming in a helicopter transporting, mock patients out in the total road closure. So I spent the day photographing and filming. So this is why I looked a little bit pinked over, but it's still fairly warm. That's why I'm sitting with water on standby, so you might see me sipping from time to time.
Well, that's okay. That's absolutely fine. I want to talk about start out. Well, we'll see where this goes, where this talk goes. We'll touch on a number of things, and I'll try to steer it one way or the other. Maybe we'll see. But I want to start off with you first, and that is that you have over 22 years experience, and from the first time that I'd spoken to you, just talking about so many different subjects. And can you tell me a little bit about the path that you've taken, or how you fell into this whole area of forensics and all the different things that you do?
So interestingly enough, if somebody told me in 1998 that I was going to work in this field, that I was ever going to end up within the police enforcement capacity, or that I would become, as involved in the industry as I am, I probably wouldn't have even started to believe them. And I might have thought it was extremely funny. Then a friend of mine was involved in a crash, and unfortunately it was serious. She ended up with retrograde amnesia and in hospital. And I went along and I kind of looked into what I thought was my version of what happened. I photographed her vehicle, the other vehicle, the scene, did some drawings. And I did like kind of a little report. Basically, it's trying to help a friend. And off I went to Canada. And while I was in Canada, her attorney contacted me and asked me if I would be willing to come and testify as an expert in court. Of course, this came as a huge shock and surprise. I wasn't anticipating that. So in anticipation of knowing that I'm going to end up in court, I started immediately looking into what the RCMP does, or the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, how they do it, what crash investigation involves. And through that, I got introduced to Mike Kennedy, and one thing led to another. Got back to South Africa. I testified in the matter, and I was accepted as an expert based on my past experience, the military experience, etc., that you've just mentioned. And then in short order, I realized that there was a big problem, and that was that at the time, back in 2000 in South Africa, only the most serious crimes involving fatalities were properly investigated. So if somebody is not seemingly not deceased at the scene, there might be no forensic investigation. And if they pass away later, it's kind of a problem. So then I decided that somebody had to go to every single crash scene to investigate it as if it's going to go to court, even if it's minor. And I just appointed myself and started doing it. One thing led to another. I was eventually appointed by government. I went on contract and did work for the so-called Road Accident Fund in South Africa, which is kind of an injury compensation fund. From there, I got registered as an official emergency service, and I started attending crash scenes in that capacity. That led me to probably about 6,000 or more actual at-scene crash investigations in about 4 years. And then, of course, I evolved, and I started working for major individual clients, got back onto working for the national government, then seconded into the police, and here I am today, 22 years later, still enjoying every day.
Yeah, that's pretty incredible. So I want to talk about some of the crash investigation work that you've been doing. So that was something that obviously was early on, and 6,000 crashes or that are potentially serious or whatever. Is there actually, before I ask you this question, I should say something, and that is that in doing like some of the research for this, a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about here with South Africa, there's obviously a lot of things that come up on the internet that are negative. And I don't want to sound so negative about South Africa, because it's a beautiful place, and I know that there's great people there and everything else. So, I hope everyone just takes this in context with in terms of what we're discussing here today, and it's not a reflection on what I feel or anything like that.
Absolutely.
And that has to do with just the level of, or the number of fatal crashes and serious car accidents. Is there something about the roads, the people, the culture in South Africa that causes a lot of problems on the roadways?
Yes. So and you'll find that I'm always very careful about how I answer questions, because my mind, I tend to think on 3 different levels, and I tend to interrupt myself a bit, as I've just done. So first of all, I think a big issue and let's be honest, just to enforce what you just said, a lot of what people perceive to be problems with South Africa, I think it's not necessarily that anything is broken. It's just that we're pretty young and still growing as a country, and especially in these fields, there's a lot of technology that even government units cannot even afford yet. So it's an evolving thing. But I would honestly tell you that from my personal experience and my own investigations, the biggest problem in South Africa to me is cultural. It's the driving culture. I grew up in an environment where wearing seatbelts was literally practically unseen. An environment where children standing on the back of pickup trucks while they're driving the highway speeds was nothing strange at all. Even today, we are still transporting people on the back of pickup trucks and semi trucks, etc., going to work and back. So our propensity to be or not to be risk averse, I think, comes from the fact that we live in the country where risk is kind of part of everyday life, and a loss of life, quite frankly, people have acclimatized, I suppose. So in countries like Sweden, which I visited, and Germany, people are extremely risk averse. The slightest miscalculation by another driver, and they immediately exclaim that it looks dangerous, and these people are idiots because it's dangerous. In South Africa, I think we have a propensity not to sense danger. People do horrendous things, and I think that's part of the problem. Probably the primary issue here is driving culture.
Okay. And what about from the police side in terms of the level of resources that they have to investigate these kinds of serious cases, in terms of the education? Is South Africa so far removed that, I mean, here in North America, for example, there's a lot of education, schools, places to get training. So what kind of facilities or what's the situation in South Africa with respect to, traffic and reconstruction?
Okay, so for starters, things are changing. There are more and more people coming into the industry. But I suppose 3 years ago, 4 years ago, I could have told you that there are no more than perhaps 15 people in the industry in South Africa, and most of them I know personally. It was a very small and very poorly developed industry, young, not poorly developed, young. A few individuals, sought refuge in this environment and like myself, developed into it. But a big issue in Africa and Southern Africa. So I've worked in South Africa, in Zambia, Tanzania, Kenya, Lesotho, Swaziland, Botswana, Namibia, all over most of Africa, Southern Africa. And a common trend is that the average police officer or law enforcement officer, that is probably the first responder to these major crash scenes, has very little or no training on the forensics aspect of it. And often they have to rely on specialized units, but these units are very scantily spread. So they often cover large areas, or they take enormous time to arrive. And because of that, it's an issue. So there are people that are, I believe, adequately qualified, skilled, experienced, and trained, but they're few and far between. This is changing, it is evolving, but they have always been very few and far between. They're often poorly equipped. And more often, they are trained, but some of what we do as crash reconstructionists comes from, I suppose, passion for the field rather than purely a career. And I think it's very easy to see the difference. Somebody that's purely attending a crash scene because it's part of their job has a propensity to kind of not show the same level of interest as somebody who made it a life's passion. And the passionate operators are still a little bit scantily spread in South Africa. So that's, as far as law enforcement is concerned, we're seeing more and more law enforcement units developing. I've trained thousands of police officers, law enforcement officers. I've trained national traffic units, provincial or state traffic units. I've trained local police officers within my own station. And this is evolving and developing, but we're not as developed. There's no official school yet where you can go like the IPTM or Northwestern University or Texas University. There's nothing that is at the same level or approaching the same level. But I'll add that the Road Traffic Management Corporation, which is a division of the National Department of Transport, they have been working over the last year on a program to launch and develop a 3-year degree in crash investigation and reconstruction. And I was, in fact, a consultant on the planning committee for that. So that's in the approval processes. We've done all the groundwork, and I think it's going well.
Excellent. And you have sort of a special situation because, for example, here in North America, it would be very difficult for me to imagine somebody on the private side, attending scenes with police. And so how does that dynamic work with you?
So 20 years ago, when I started going to crash scenes, it was absolutely unheard of and never seen. So, of course, when I arrived to the vehicle with lights on the roof and a siren and a camera in my hand, I was threatened with arrest in short order. Luckily, I was never actually arrested, and I think it came from the fact that I have quite a good understanding of law even from before that. And over time, we've developed to, as I said, I started working with and for government, eventually became a contractor to the national government. And now it's become, due to the limited amount of people in the industry, it has become more natural for private specialists to arrive at live crash scenes. And also, due to the way in which our criminal justice system works, it takes a lot of time to get evidence out of a law enforcement unit, and sometimes it's not possible simply because of the nature of a crime scene. So then often people are forced to kind of collect their own evidence, because while the criminal matter is developing, they have civil matters that prevail. They have to go to court for civil liabilities. They've got insurance claims, and they've got injury compensation claims. So because of that, to give you an example, as an on-duty law enforcement officer, I attended a crash scene in 2005. I only testified on the matter in 2016. That's 11 years later. So because of how slow the process of justice can be here, it's prudent and intelligent for people to engage their own private experts to gather the evidence and to produce report. I produce a report for my clients within as much as 3 or 4 days sometimes. And when it's a major case and a lot of data has to come in, maybe 15 days. I've worked with the national government doing major crash investigations all over the country, and all my reports had to be in within 30 days. So those reports from the private industry, we have the technology, the resources, and the ability. But then it's also, we have to keep in mind that I can choose what cases I do. I can choose how many cases I accept. I can select which client I feel like servicing, and I can deploy to the scene at my own leisure. Whereas if you work in a law enforcement unit, you might be sent to 40 cases in a month, whether you want to go there or not. And then you've got to go and leave. You've got off-duty times. So I'm not saying that we are better because we are faster. We are faster because we have a much smaller workload. And because we are paid for every case we do as a private contractor, it's much more beneficial for me to focus on that case properly and to attend to it with greater interest. And I think that's the biggest difference between law enforcement and the private sector in South Africa. It's the difference in let's call it the business and costing model.
What happens in the case where there's a serious accident, or what's sort of the threshold where it becomes a civil matter and then it becomes a criminal matter? Like, is that clearly defined, or?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it is. Civil matters involve damages to vehicles and liabilities for losses. It's a delictual issue. You bump my car, I bump yours. It might just be a scratch. It might just be a flat tire, or it might be a total write-off and a loss of life. But the civil matter runs totally independently from any criminal matter. Criminal matters prevail where any crime is linked to the crash. So either it could be reckless and or negligent driving, where there's a criminal charge laid. It could be drunken driving or alcohol intoxication, DUI. It could be a culpable homicide. We call it culpable homicide, which is a involuntary homicide as well. It would be involuntary manslaughter, where somebody passes away, but we haven't. And we have crash cases where we actually also have murder charges linked to them. So whenever there's a suspicion of an actual crime, it becomes a criminal matter. And often the criminal matter and the civil matter will run concurrently. And even more often, the civil lawsuit will kind of be placed on hold because people are very pensively waiting for the outcome of the criminal matter. Because if you're found guilty by the court for the crime you committed in this case, then obviously I don't have to pay your insurance, payout for the damages to your car, or I'm not liable to you or whatever. So that we see a lot is that I often get involved in cases where there are concurrent issues, where I'm testifying in and contributing to the criminal matter, but at the same time a civil matter is running. But of course there are different rules that govern them. And the rules of evidence are slightly different. What's allowed or not is slightly different, as in most countries, but that's essentially it, yes.
Okay. In the South African criminal justice system, there's several components here, and one of them is the South African Police Service. I guess it's SAPS is what you call them. But is there only one police? Is SAPS is the only? How does the policing structure work?
So it's kind of interesting. We have the South African Police, which is a national law enforcement body that's essentially run by the national government via the departments in the various provinces or states into the various regions. The South African police service has a mandate to investigate any crime that takes place in the country. Within that, there are certain divisions that are specialized, but it all falls within the South African police. Now, at city or at city level, we also have many metropolitan police units. We have the Cape Town Metropolitan Police, we've got Durban Metropolitan Police, we've got Pretoria or Tshwane Metropolitan Police, we've got Johannesburg Metropolitan Police, and the Metropolitan Police focuses on things like road crimes and general enforcement within a particular region, a local area. Then we have what is called provincial traffic authorities and citywide traffic authorities. So you might have the City of Cape Town Traffic Department, then you might have the Provincial Traffic Department. So I suppose our South African police is like the police in the US. Our provincial traffic is a lot like state troopers, and our metro police is a lot like the sheriffs to some extent. So that's the way in which that fits together. So you can come across a variety of these different law enforcement units. Each has their own set of skills and interests. But when it's a major road crime, the criminal docket will typically be carried by the South African police. So if a metro police or a traffic police officer arrests somebody for drunken driving, they take them to a South African police station and they charge them, and the docket is carried by the South African police. So they almost a little bit like the custodians of criminal prosecution, for lack of a better term.
So the SA does the SAPS, I mean, they do the investigation, they do all that sort of thing. And what about on the forensic side? Like, is there like a forensics lab that's national or something, or local?
Yeah, so we have what we call a local criminal record center, or LCRC, often just called CRC. They are the photographers and the forensic evidence gatherers, etc. They have decent resources. They typically are well equipped. But I'll be honest with you that their capacity, their skills, and perhaps even the equipment, the technology they have available is much more aligned with crimes like shootings, robberies, rapes, these kinds of things. So I suppose what you would typically classify as crimes in the classical sense, where one person does something to the other intentionally, robberies, armed robberies, business robberies. So for that, they pretty much equipped. On crash investigation, they have smaller quantities, they have collision units from the South African police side, but now the Metro Police are starting to have collision units as well, and they kind of all plug in together. Sometimes you'll find several of them at the same scene, but I've been called to scenes that I've driven almost 3.5 hours to get to, where I've arrived and the whole scene is still secure and no forensic unit has arrived yet because they're engaged in other matters or they have to travel far. So that happens.
Interesting. And then from the police, they will pass that on to the prosecution service, or the National Prosecuting Authority, I guess is what it's called.
Yeah. So the prosecution is run by the Department of Justice and the National Prosecuting Authority. The National Prosecuting Authority is essentially runs part of the court, as in the judges, etc., and the Department of Justice runs the magistrates and the court orderlies and whatever. So it's two units that run concurrently to manage the criminal legal process. So the easy way to explain it, the duty of a police officer is to detect a crime, to find evidence of the crime, to identify a suspect in that crime, to find evidence linking the suspect to the crime, and then to hand the suspect and the evidence over to the Department of Justice for prosecution. Of course, they would testify later, etc., but it's their job to bring the suspect to the system of justice. And technically, their duties stop when that job is completed.
The system, at court or at trial it's based on a Roman Dutch early system, but you don't have juries.
Yeah, so no, we don't have juries. We have so the courts, we have kind of local courts, regional courts, magistrates courts, of course, the High Court, and then the Supreme Court, etc. So we also have court levels. But no, in every single case in South Africa, there is typically a single judiciary officer. It could be a magistrate or a judge, and the magistrate or the judge has to absorb, consider, and opine on the guilt or the innocence of the accused party. And even in civil matters, there's a single judge that makes a decision. So we don't have jury cases now.
Okay, but so for example, in your case, when they need to hire an expert for crash or shootings or whatever it might be, can either side hire you, or are you hired by the court?
So it's kind of a little bit of a strange thing with me, because as a former police officer, I have an affinity for the prosecution process. So sometimes I might have a family approach me and say, my father, mother, brother, sister passed away. The state is prosecuting. They don't have experts available. We want to hire you. Then the family will pay me to be at the beck and call and behest of the state for the prosecution. I could have somebody from an actual court, such as a prosecutor or sometimes even a magistrate, contact me and say, we require an expert. And if it's a matter of local travel and there's no national travel, etc., involved, I might assist them for free. Then I become an expert for the state based on my history in law enforcement and working with the government. It might also happen that they'll say from Cape Town and they contact me. And I say, well, look, because it's so far, because it's a complicated case, and because I have to visit the scene first, etc., I would have to, you'd have to engage my services by hiring me. And to that, they typically either ask me for a quotation or they tell me what their budget is. Their budgets are substantially lower than my clients can afford. But I believe, firstly, that it's a duty. It's my duty to ensure that I maintain a balance and work on both sides of the spectrum, to not only understand the dynamics, but also to be sure that I don't become known as that guy who's always working for one particular side. So I work with the Department of Justice, I work with the private sector, I work for the prosecution, I work for the defense, and sometimes I also work for insurance companies, for instance, sometimes against them. But I prefer to do that, and I prefer to try and maintain that balance, so that I don't become known as a so-called hired gun for a particular type of case.
Right. Now that makes sense. Before you had mentioned about the time that it takes to sometimes prosecute, and so I was curious about that, and I remember seeing a video where they talk about maybe one reason is that in your system, the prosecutor or the prosecuting office can often kick back a case and say, hey, no, you guys need to continue or do more investigation or do more work, or I'd like you to do this. And I guess that isn't very much different than here, but it just seems to be a little bit more official in South Africa.
Yeah. So a prosecutor, so within each court document, within criminal docket, there's a diary from the police officer where he writes in everything he does. And that docket goes to the prosecutor for inspection. The prosecutor looks through it. They decide that there's statements that are missing or they need clarification or whatever, and they write back instructions on that diary for the officer to complete. And the reason why this is because our officers in South Africa, I'm talking about the general law enforcement officers, detectives, etc., they are not necessarily trained and qualified in law. So they don't have law degrees. So as a result, they sometimes don't fully appreciate, let's call it, the legal requirements for a prosecution as a prosecutor would. So to that end, they'd go, look, I'm not happy with the statement because the chain of custody is not in place. Get the chain of custody sorted out, etc. But a bigger reason why cases take so long is not because of that. A big thing that affects every one of my friends in law enforcement that are detectives is that our police officers, our detectives, who are the people, the actual custodians of crime investigations, of collecting, of gathering all the evidence and compiling it into a report for the court, they're extremely overworked. I mean, an average police detective in South Africa, I might be wrong because last time I was aware of this could have been maybe 10 years ago, but a single detective could have 150 or 200 dockets that they are working on. Those are cases that they are investigating, and there are new ones coming in all the time because of the high crime rate. So yes, those cases can get prioritized. Somebody might be assaulted but not end up in hospital permanently or disabled, and then there's somebody who's shot. So clearly the shooting case kind of gets to the top of the pile, and there's feedback. Or a family from a deceased might go to the National Prosecuting Authority or the Independent Police Investigative Directorate, or even to a national or provincial commission, and complain that they don't get feedback. Then the detective is called in and forced to attend to that matter, but he's got 200 others. So it's a very, very unfair scenario, and I feel terribly sorry for the officers out there that are forced to work on that many dockets at once. You cannot achieve, let's call it, any reasonable level of professionalism if your time is just so divided.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I know that in many places where I've worked, for example, in some places in South America, I mean, an investigation is literally you show up and you take pictures and you've got to move to the next one because a Friday night or a Saturday night in some of these very large cities where there's over 20 million people, it's unsustainable. You just can't keep up with the workload.
Wrap your mind around this for a second. In Port Elizabeth, which is a fairly small city, about 1 million people, um, my record for crash investigation that's my own personal record going to physical scenes, is I've been to 16 crash scenes in a single night, 36 in one single weekend. That's from Friday evening through Sunday evening, and 204 in a single 30-day month. Obviously, they're not all serious. Sometimes it's very minor, but the fact is, if we have that many crashes happening in but one city, you can imagine the state that's on a national basis and in bigger cities like Johannesburg, Durban, and Cape Town. So it's very unfortunate that we don't have the resources for more police officers to be dedicated to these kinds of things, and that they are overworked. But essentially, it brings us back to what I just stated, and I can just reiterate it.
Right. Now, and you've been around. I mean, you've been to Canada, you've been to the US, you've been to other places in Africa as well. And so, I think that's an interesting perspective that you have from looking at it. And so I want to ask you about perhaps the types of crimes that are occurring in South Africa that maybe, and of course the same crimes happen everywhere, just in some places they're much more exaggerated. And you were on television, I guess, before. You were talking about things like smash and grab. You were talking about things like hijackings and stuff. So what kinds of things are happening in South Africa that maybe aren't happening here in North America or in other places?
One, and I'm going to go straight to a very, very sensitive topic in South Africa, but quite frankly, I don't feel in the least bothered by mentioning it because I think it's not getting enough attention at all. We have one type of crime in South Africa that's fairly unique, and that is so-called farm murders. It's extremely prolific. You can have as many as 10 farm attacks on a weekend. Hundreds of South African farmers are murdered. And what makes these crimes unique is they are often involve extreme torture and extreme violence. I'm talking about elderly people burned with irons, with an ironing iron. It is an iron. I'm talking about people having super glue put in their eyes. I'm talking about people having drills put to their knees and stuff. In one particular case, and these people are often elderly people, 60s, 70s, 80s. In one particular case, somebody was attacked on their farm, and they were murdered, and they'd returned from church. It was a Sunday, and their Bible was put on their chest, and the cross was cut into the chest. Now, I haven't seen this, but I believe this to be the case. So I can't say that I've been there, but nothing about these stories surprises me. So farm murders is, in my opinion, not getting the right level of attention because it's not perhaps understood properly by the powers that be, or it's seen as just part. Because a typical argument would be, yes, it's true, we did have 30 farmers murdered this month, but we had many other murders of many other people. Why would farmers be special? Well, they'd be special because they are isolated. They are far from police, law enforcement services. They are elderly. They are incapable of properly defending themselves, and they are brutally tortured, sometimes for even 24 hours before they are murdered. And often there's hardly much stolen. It's a little bit of money and some firearms. That's a type of crime that I believe that's unique, and it's unique for us. I don't see that in many other countries. Cash in transit heists, the cash van bombings and cash van attacks is on the rise, man. It's just getting completely out of control in South Africa. And they will ram, like in the movie Heat, I think it was, where they ram the cash van and then they attack the officers or the cash security officers. They take the money and they blow it up with explosives. The blowing up of Autobank teller machines, that happens all the time, which is also unique to South Africa. And of course, hijackings, robberies. I'm talking about aggravated robberies where 7 or 8 or 9 or 12 armed gunmen would attack a store and just steal a bunch of cell phones, laptops, or whatever. They'd hold the people hostage during the period and they'd run off with it. So our crimes tend to be almost based on guerrilla warfare. It's almost like a guerrilla warfare crime model. It's typically an extreme show of force, even whether it's individually or whether it's in group crime type scenarios. It involves an element of extreme force. It involves an element of extreme physical oppression or control of a situation, and it typically involves ties to more international crime, vehicles going over borders, drugs and whatnot. So the levels of violence, I'm not talking about cartel violence. We have shootings by linked to so-called gangsterism, etc. as well. Within the cartel and gang and drug trade environment, there's these let's call it this infighting, this factional fighting. They are violent by design as well, but they're pretty much topical. It's normally group on group, and while it's terrible and we don't for a minute condone that it happens, it's not, in my mind, as terrible as somebody innocently sitting in their house or at their business or at their premises, and people come in there to attack people they've never met, never known. There's no territorial issue or whatever. It's just the nature of crime. But due to the way in which law enforcement is hampered and how difficult it is to divide the work among the few people we have available to do it, of course, there will be a higher crime rate because it's an opportunity, right? So this is unfortunately the way it unfolds, as I see it at least.
What are the gun laws like in South Africa? If somebody legally wants to own a gun, of course, there's going to be always the illegal guns and gangs and things like that, but I'm curious about legal gun ownership.
Yeah, so my wife and I own firearms. Well, I have. I don't own a firearm right now, but we both did. I've carried firearms for most of my life. I started carrying 45s when I was 18 years old. So the gun laws in South Africa is as follows. Firstly, you can apply for a gun license from the time you're 16 years old. From there, you can own just about any personal defense weapon, because we have licenses for personal defense, licenses for hunting, licenses for collection, and licenses for sporting. There are others like dealers, etc., but for the common public. So let's say you are purely just concerned about your own safety, you're worried about your house being attacked, etc. So you would go to a local firearms school, and you would go for instruction to achieve something called a competency. That competency is a certificate that's issued to you. It covers aspects of the Firearm Law or the Firearms Act of South Africa. It covers the issues of firearm use, firearm control, the mechanics of firearms, and you have a little bit of a test to shoot, etc. So now you are declared competent. So you don't have a criminal record. Your neighbors don't think you're a maniac, and you essentially have shown the appropriate skills and knowledge to own a firearm. Now you apply for a firearm license. You go to a local police station, but first you need to go and find a firearm you want, a specific one with a serial number. So if I want to buy a Glock 19 with a serial number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I must go to a gun dealership. I must look at the firearms. I want that one. They say, fine, if you want that one, you pay me for it. After you've paid me for it, I give you all the paperwork. Then you apply for your license. That application is rather onerous. You have to motivate the reasons. You have to quote crime statistics. You have to explain why you need it. You need support from your wife and your neighbors to say it's okay for you to own a firearm, etc. Now, it's quite a complicated story, but the bottom line is when you follow all the rules, etc., and you've sent in your application, you could have your firearm license in your hand and go to fetch your personal gun within 6 months, if you're lucky, or it could be 4 years and you just never know. We have again, same problem. Thousands of applications, a few people working in piles and piles and piles of applications lying. Some people just happen to fall in the bottom of the pack and they never get to the top. And, it's fortunate for us with law enforcement background, because if I apply for a firearm license, part of my application, quotes my law enforcement history and the number of firearms I've owned, etc. And I believe that in the eye of the approving party, the person who ultimately says, okay, you're allowed to have a gun. As far as that person is concerned, they read through and they go, he's not a maniac, man. He was in law enforcement, etc. So it probably helps a bit. But unfortunately, the use of a firearm gets extremely technical. Our legal system is designed on the premise that can be described as the tantamount sanctity of life. You are never allowed to take a life of another person if it's absolutely the very last resort, that there was absolutely no other option available to you. If you wake up in the middle of the night and you see a figure in your room and you just take out your gun and you shoot at them, and it turns out it was your neighbor who took a wrong turn, was drunk, and your door wasn't locked, you're in a hell of a lot of trouble, because we don't have the castle doctrine like in the US, where they breach your moat and then your castle, you have the right to protect your castle. It's seen as an attack. In fact, on a constitutional level, through the Constitutional Court in South Africa, it was ruled that firearm ownership is not a right in South Africa, it's a privilege. So to own a firearm is not something. We don't have a Second Amendment. We don't have anything written into our constitution saying you have the right to bear arms to protect you from your government. If you want to own a firearm, it's up to you to convince the government that they're not making a mistake by allowing it. That's, I suppose, the short version of what that is about.
So in the case of, for example, Oscar Pistorius, he didn't really have a chance because it wasn't a last resort thing. It was more of a mistake, or maybe not. I don't know, but
well, you see now, this is exactly what you said when we begin. Depending on what we cover, I'm not happy with the way the whole court case unfolded. I'll tell you what I'm concerned about, or why I'm concerned about that particular case. If John Mbula shot Mary Mbula in a so-called township or an informal settlement in South Africa through the bedroom door, the trial would be over and done in anything from a year to 10 years, depending on how quick the court case works. He'd probably get some kind of sentence. It might be that he goes to jail for a year or two. It might even be that he gets a fine, or he gets out on bail, or he gets out on good behavior very quickly. And a lot of what happened in the media was that everybody had to understand that Oscar Pistorius, despite being a celebrity and international sports star, was not going to get any kind of special treatment. I can honestly tell you that he didn't. He definitely didn't get special treatment. He only got a special prosecution. I think personally that it's unfair that that level of prosecution is brought to bear in his case, because he will not be favored in any way, while people who are murdered under much worse circumstances, take farm murders as an example, those suspects are not treated the same way. They're not prosecuted with the same vigor. They don't get the best prosecutors at the highest courts in South Africa to cross-examine them for 5 days, and multiple experts and ballistics or whatever. So I think guilt or not is not even the discussion here. I just think it's very sad that we have a situation where we claim that celebrities don't get any special treatment. But if we look at the way in which they are treated, it's very special indeed. So that's the part that disappointed me a little bit about his trial. We could get into semantics of the actual evidence and the facts, but that's probably for another day and another time.
Well, let me backtrack for a second, because there was another question I wish to ask you about the guns, the use of guns in crime. So I would imagine that gun theft is probably a big thing. If there's a large number of the population which own guns, then gun thefts might be important. And is there a black market for guns? And I don't mean because, for example, here in Canada, a lot of the guns come in from the US. So they come in from our southern border, because there's nothing in the northern border. So we only have a southern border, really. But that's really the problem. The criminals are not going to go through the process of registering a gun and everything else, especially here in Canada. It's too much work. It's much easier to just buy a gun on the black market. But what's that like in South Africa?
Firstly, why any government thinks that by making gun ownership onerous, impossible, or outlawed for legal gun owners or non-criminal entities would in fact discourage a criminal from owning a firearm is far beyond my understanding. So there's an interesting development in South Africa, or an interesting situation again. There are definitely many crimes where legal firearm owners are disarmed, or their firearms are taken away and stolen. The problem is that most of the firearms used in crimes, I'm talking serious crimes, armed robberies, hijackings, these things, we see regular news articles where those firearms were in fact from law enforcement origin, from military origin. And then we have a very large contingent of firearms that are brought in across borders, your AK-47s, your heavy caliber weapons. But now another unique problem that we have that I didn't even mention earlier is the issue of rhino poaching. And elephant poaching, and even lion poaching. So poaching in Africa in general, but specifically in South Africa, we come across firearms that are 30-aught 6 caliber and 375 Holland caliber, and they've got silencers fitted, etc. So these outfits are quite skilled. But I'd say a larger percentage of illegal firearms in South Africa lie with the very hardened criminals because of these major crimes we have. many firearms are stolen from. I have a dog, by the way. We have regularly police destroy, say, 15,000 firearms that remain unclaimed. So there's a huge flaw in South Africa. Despite this very onerous registration process, recovered firearms are extremely seldom reunited with their legal owners. Because if you lose a firearm in South Africa, you are declared unfit to own one. If you forget your firearm anyway, you can't show that it was taken in a crime, you are declared unfit to own a firearm. So in many cases, the firearms are stolen, but they're like pistols and maybe rifles, etc. I'm talking about hunting rifles. When it comes to semi-automatic rifles and things like that used in major crimes, they more, in my mind, they come more from cross-border. They are illegally brought into the country, held in stashes all over the country and distributed that way, perhaps from law enforcement environments. And then, but now a lot of private security companies are starting to use semi-automatic rifles and carbines, etc. But I don't come across many cases where security officers are disarmed. I come across many more cases where, for instance, we've had military personnel robbed at military bases at knife point. People are with knives and rob the officers of their firearms. And in South Africa, because these crimes are so common, most people know it's just not worth it. Let him have the gun. I'm not going to die for it. It's not mine. Take the gun, And that's the problem. And I'm not saying that people should resist or fight back or attempt to take on an armed attacker, be it knife or firearm. But we are not a resistant society, because people go, it's not worth it. They take 100 cars a day. If they want your car, let them have the car. If they want your stuff, let them take it. That's unfortunately, again, a culture issue, but it does play a role.
You had mentioned once, I think it was in an interview that you did on the car hijackings, where, the criminals know that people are not resisting because they're being told, don't resist, just give everything away. So they can walk up and say, hey, I'm hijacking you, and they hand over the keys and that's it. So yeah, it may be, obviously you don't want to resist and then get killed, but there may be something there where criminals have it a little bit easier.
Well, I'll tell you what, for instance, shocked me a little bit is that in one of our provinces, the provincial police commissioner went, I think it was on television or radio, I can't remember, but I remember the story, went on public media and said there were beaches in the area that people were regularly robbed in the beaches. And then eventually said, listen, people should please not go to the beaches in the evenings because there are robbers there. So that bothers me, because now we are sending the message that law-abiding citizens should essentially jail or detain themselves at home not to be the victims of crime. I think that's preposterous. There should be, if there's a crime trend in an area, instead of telling people to stay away, you should invite more people so you have witnesses, and you should deploy more resources to apprehend the criminals. It's just, to me, it's a little bit, sometimes the system is a little bit upside down with some of the ways in which they tried. Because let's face it, if you remove the victims, the crime rate will drop, right? So then it looks like you're effective at what you do as a police service, because you've just fought crime. But you haven't really. You've just moved the criminals to other areas, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah. Tell me about some of the work you've done in some of the other countries around you in Africa. Are you running just training courses there? Are you actually doing cases there? What do you have going on?
So mostly I have clients that travel all over Africa. I work very, regularly with the heavy commercial transport sector or the semi-truck transport industry. It's kind of been my staple for most of my career. And many of these people travel into other countries, but equally in other countries, the rest of Southern Africa, they don't have any experts at all. So by the time a case gets complicated enough and they need experts, they'll call on me. Now, I've typically only worked crash cases in other countries, but I've consulted on other matters, robberies, etc., kidnappings even. So where I'm approached, so this is what makes me unique. While I do primarily work as a crash reconstruction specialist, and that's what I advertise, that's what I promote, and that's what I present to my clients. I've worked on murder cases, hangings. I've worked on vehicle hijackings, attacks, robberies, business robberies. But I don't promote that because I believe that I'm already a jack of all trades as it is. And by the time you start dividing yourself a little bit too much, I think there's going to come a stage where you become unbelievable. People say, please, didn't I just hear in an accident case, now you're a gun specialist, and tomorrow now you're a robbery guy? Who are you really? And I don't like, creating the sensation that I'm, literally a prostitute for hire. If the case falls within the scope of my expertise and skills, I'll probably engage in it, but only on special requests for particular clients. But I don't try to promote other services. Those come to me because of the background and the knowledge I have. But again, you can be a jack of all trades, but within a certain field. And if you spread a little bit too far, it's a little bit, and it sounds silly, but it's a little bit like somebody who's, for instance, a lawyer, but she happens to also be a model, and all her social media profiles is about her modeling. So the question is, who are you? Are you a lawyer or you're a model? And unfortunately, what happens is, as a lawyer, it's difficult for you to achieve credibility because people perceive you as a model. And as a model, it's difficult for you, to stand equal because you interpret things as a lawyer does. So I try to govern myself to remain fairly niche as far as possible, at least.
What are some of the changes that you've seen on the whole collision reconstruction side from when you started, 20 years ago, let's say, to today? Like, have you seen people changes, educational changes? Like, what kinds of things are notable?
You'll be surprised to hear that I was the first person in Africa to use digital cameras. At the time when I started using digital cameras for crash investigation in 2000, I was told by all and sundry that I'm totally wasting my time and that digital photography will never, ever be accepted in a court of law in South Africa, which was obviously absolutely not true. I was the first person in crash investigation to use laser total stations. That's now a common thing that's used by many collision units. I was the first person to use drone photography, the first person to introduce animations, the first person to work with photogrammetry with some of the software like the Pharaoh Zone software, which is an evolution of some of the software I worked with in the past. So 20 years ago, only fatal cases were investigated by police officers or by law enforcement, and any other case was considered a civil matter. It has changed because now many more cases, because there are more collision units out there, are being attended by these units. 20 years ago, no private investigator would be allowed onto a crash scene. Now private investigators are engaged by government and seen at scenes regularly. 20 years ago, law enforcement units would go out to the scene, they'd photograph the vehicles that are involved, the marks on the road, the location of the bodies, and basically some tire marks, if there are any, just to show that there was a crime, where it happened, and what the elements were. That's changed. 20 years ago, the courts were not as experienced at working with experts or expert witnesses. I personally watched the evolution. 20 years ago, I had to be extremely careful about getting too scientific because I'd go whoosh right over people's heads. And what you can see your judicial officer just glazing over it when they start looking around and they're writing notes and they're kind of picking their teeth and perhaps even falling asleep, which I physically see. Then you know you've lost them, right? Now we've gotten to the stage where I've gotten involved just now recently in the last month or two in the 3D printing. I'm now starting to print damage. This is just my first little car I ever printed. And now we've got cases like a crash scene that I'm investigating where there's an issue about so-called blind rises and dips. So I've actually printed a sequence based on the physical measurements of the scene to illustrate to the court that, we can't go back to the scene. The crash happened in 2014. We're in court in 2022. The road has been completely re-engineered, but we have the original measurements. Now, measurements mean nothing to a judicial officer. They look at numbers on a page. So I turn it into a physical model I can put down in front of them and say, while it's smaller, it's the same place. Now find the blind rise. And this is the kind of stuff that we haven't seen. 3D laser scanning, for instance. I've started working with the Pharaoh Technologies type stuff as well, and we started scanning scenes, animations, photogrammetry is new. You're quite involved in that, of course. I started with photogrammetry perhaps in 2004, the old, what was it called, photo modeler. You would be familiar with that, and things
Yes.
moved on and new technologies, and it's now Pix 4D and whatever. And I've worked with that. And so, yes, there's a lot in my mind that has changed. It's now possible for me to meet with government departments and to discuss the problems in industry and to get them to say to me, can you train some of our people? Whereas 20 years ago, when I went to spoke about their problems, they considered me some private guy, so-called private dick coming along and telling them what's wrong. Um, that has changed. And I'm very enthused by the way in which things are changing. It's slow. I sometimes feel like we're moving backwards a little bit, like recently, but despite all that, I think the move is positive and it's going in the right direction.
Have you had any challenges, or do you find that the courts are quite receptive when you bring, these newer technologies in, or these 3D prints and things like that?
No, I think I must be honest. Our courts enjoy it. I think everybody watches TV, and programs like CSI and these kinds of programs have had the positive impact that they've educated common people, including judiciary officers, on the kinds of technologies that are available and the way in which they work. And I'm very sensitive of the so-called CSI effect, because what happens, and for those who are listening who don't know what it is, the CSI effect is that when you come with technology and you've got lasers and you've got 3D models and stuff, sometimes the court becomes enamored by it and they start believing everything you say because it seems so cool and it's so awesome, but they don't have the capacity to critically consider the evidence you are presenting. So that has concerned me. So I've been conservative in how I present this evidence and the way in which I bring it to court. That's why I spend a lot of time explaining the technology and my background in the technology and what it does and what it can do before I present the evidence. But I find that the courts, I haven't experienced a single trial where I've introduced technology or modern ways of doing things where the courts have gone, what? No, we don't agree. I can tell you that on the field of lighting technology, lighting science, we are way behind the US. I would go as far as to say I think I'm the only proper lighting expert that exists in Africa at the moment. Not because I think I'm better, because I don't do many cases that focus only on lighting, but there's such a gross misunderstanding. And by the time you try and explain that technology in courts, it's very difficult unless you find a way to illustrate it in a way that they can visually understand.
Right. I'm going to bring up your website here in just a second, and I want to ask you about, so IBF investigations. When did you first start IBF, and what is it that you typically do today? I mean, obviously you're doing a lot of cases, but you're doing different types of training too.
Yeah, sure. So I started this business in 2000 when I returned from Canada and I started testifying. At the time, I was called Millennium Solutions. It wasn't an official business. It was just a name I'd given myself. And then I then started to work in this field officially and started to get contracts and stuff. And then I was called the Independent Bureau of Forensic Investigation, or IBFI. Then I had to register the business as an official business, as a so-called proprietary business in South Africa. And you don't have enough space on the form to fill in your full name. So I had to do something. So I registered as IBF Investigations, and that was probably around 2006 or so. And since then, I've been IBF Investigations. My logo has gone through some evolutions as I've grown up and I've expanded. Right now, I do primarily, or the fields I'm focused on is the at-scene crash investigation, post-event crash investigation, analysis and reconstruction, court testimony. I write a lot of articles. I love writing about this industry. I love giving people the opportunity to understand it better. I create a lot of video content. I've got training courses on Udemy, for instance, that are running. I do practical training. Of course, I testify as an expert. And then, as you've said as in the introduction, I do public speaking as well. And I'm fairly regularly on television shows, but it's kind of undulating. Sometimes I appear in 5 shows in a row, and then for a year, nothing, because nothing major happens that captures people. And then one event happens and it's a crash or it's a hijacking or it's a robbery or whatever. And then a journalist who's familiar with me or seen some of my stuff will contact me and say, listen, we need to get you on TV. So that's the way that unfolds.
Okay. I know you have your hands in so many different things, but I want to ask you, what's next for you? Is there anything that you're sort of working on, preparing, researching, or is there an area that you're looking to move into? What's sort of your next move?
So yes, one of the things that I think I've got plans for next year already, and one of the things I want to focus much more on is training. I still believe that, unfortunately, you get people that are quite well trained. They've been to multiple training courses, but I think a big problem, and I think it's not only here, a big problem globally, is that people love the good stuff, the juicy stuff, the mathematics and the analysis and the mechanical, disassembly and stuff. I still find that people fail at the basics. I work opposite experts that have 20 plus years experience, and consistently we essentially find fault in their work, not based on the science, based on the basics. So I want to focus more on training. Next year, I'm getting very deeply involved in the 3D printing. I want to start doing that much more passionately, and this is why I'm exploring. In fact, I bought an iPhone today just so that I can get into this technology with the LiDAR scanning, etc. And then I am also exploring the possibility of expanding into specialized training. I do a lot of so-called videographic route risk assessments. Those are tactical route assessments. My clients drive a particular route. There's a high crash rate, a high crime rate, a high robbery rate. And then I go out and I film and assess that road, and I make an actual video explaining the risks, etc., because it's visual and it's moving images. And then I do a lot of tactical risk analysis on buildings and premises as well. I've formed a partnership with Faro Technologies. I'm an authorized distributor and a beta tester for the technologies. This year has been a difficult year because we're coming out of COVID. A lot of government departments were kind of on the back burner and people were slow. And I'm hoping to focus much more on that in the new year. But anybody who knows me in South Africa and probably that follow me on social media must have noticed I've been much more active lately. We're starting to put out more video content and posts. So I'm hoping that by creating awareness and sharing some of these incidents, I'm in a position to try and subtly influence and educate people towards a safer tomorrow. That's the best I can hope for.
Yeah, and I would say that if anyone wants to check out Stan's website here, ibfusa.info, there are a number of articles and blogs and things like that, some really good information. And I think you have some links there to like videos. Actually, if you go on YouTube, you can find a number of interviews and that sort of thing too. Also, just so I can, I'm going to bring this up on the screen here, but I guess people can get a hold of you through the website. There's a contact information
Correct.
here. Let's see. It's under
Engage. My phone number is right there as well. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So you can just go ahead and fill in the form. I had a problem trying to get the LinkedIn before. I'm not sure if that's going to work, but something was going on with LinkedIn where it wasn't really working all that well. Let's see if I can get it going now, because or just people can reach out to you there. I'm pretty sure I can see you're here, but when I click on it, no, it won't let me do it here this time, but that's okay.
So strange, because the same thing, for some reason, we've been disconnected. I can't see your profile either. But I mean, I can't, it tells me to connect with you. When I try and say to connect, it just says there's an error. It's very unfortunate, but I'm on LinkedIn as Stanley Bezuidenhout. Anybody looking for me can look for me under my full name, Stanley Bezuidenhout. I like to link up with people. I like to exchange ideas, as you know now. Just so that everybody knows, our discussion started basically just from saying, listen, we've got to have a chat. We ended up having a chat, and one thing led to another. And here we are some weeks later, and it looks like a bromance is developing. So
it's true. Well, we always get into so many different topics, and at some point in the future, I think I'm gonna have to invite you back, and maybe we can focus in on something more specific. So, absolutely. Stanley, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and your input, and I love the fact that you have just this really wide perspective. I think it's extremely beneficial for your work and for you, and it helps a lot of other people too.
Absolutely, and it's my pleasure. I'm very passionate. I haven't for a single day in the last 22 years questioned, my standing in this industry. I love it.
Excellent. Hey, so hang back for a second. I'm just going to make some closing comments, and then I'll chat with you in a second. All right, thanks.
Perfect.
Okay, folks, that does it for this particular episode. I just wanted to remind people that the Forensic Photography Symposium, again, is going to be January 16th to 19th, 2023. And if you like forensic photography, or if you use photography in your work, whether it's for a crime scene, whether it's for accident reconstruction, whether it's in a medical capacity for pathology or whatever, you may be interested in this particular conference. And all you have to do is just head over to the website. It's my personal website, but there's a little /.fps, and when you go over there is information. There's a pre-registration, so if you're not ready to register right now, registration is open. But if you're not ready, just hit the pre-register. We'll keep you updated when there's a new schedule that comes out, any information, on new speakers, sponsors, and things like that. So that's pretty much it. So, folks, I want to say thank you very much. There's been some people here in the chat window, making some comments. So thank you very much for that. And hey, we'll catch you next time on Forensics Talks. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.